Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burack of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back for another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. In today's interview, instead of doing a normal markets related interview, I'm bringing back a returning guest. I used to interview him a lot in 2015, 2016, 2017. My YouTube channel was almost shut off and demonetized. There was no growth. It went from like 300,000 to 500,000 views per month down to almost zero. They took away all my ad revenues when I was interviewing him about the WikiLeaks Podesta emails and the Clinton Foundation back then. Fast forward almost 10 years to today, we have all this stuff coming out lately. First, it was the USAID fraud scandal that came out thanks to the Department of Government Efficiency and Trump winning the election. Also, recently in interviews, we've had other whistleblowers come forward. I think Mike Benz from the State Department Cybersecurity Division, he's talked about it on Joe Rogan. Elon Musk has talked about it in depth on Joe Rogan. This guy was doing it, ladies and gentlemen, over a decade ago. He was investigating into stuff when it was not popular. Charles Ortel and I thought that some of this stuff might never see the light of day. Charles Ortel, thank you for joining me again.
Thank you, Jason, for having me back on.
And for our listeners out there, Charles has a long resume on Wall Street. He was a successful investment banker and hedge fund manager. You also had a radio show, right, for a while too?
Yeah, with the Washington Times, yeah.
Yeah, so Charles accomplished a lot. He's now retired, and back around 2015 or so, he started focusing on looking into charity fraud because it was just absolutely pervasive with people up there in DC, the heads of the government, people in Congress. And so Charles was talking about this stuff way before the USAID scandal broke. But now that we have this stuff coming out, I thought it was smart to bring back Charles and talk about it. So Charles, do you think if Kamala Harris had won the election, do you think we would have heard about any of this stuff with USAID and the Department of Government Efficiency and the wasted of the funds?
I think if Kamala Harris had won the election, you and I would now be in a remote prison somewhere, turning big rocks into smaller rocks if we were lucky. Kamala Harris's whole life is a fraud. If you believe Candace Owens, she's not, her ethnicity is not as described. If you look at her political career, she was attorney general during the time that the Clinton Foundation was most actively defrauding the general public and its donors. She failed to prosecute the Clinton Foundation for obvious fraud, even though her department, the charity bureau inside the Attorney General's office had put various legs of the Clinton Foundation under not sanction exactly, but had said that their filings were not correct. One of the most important things and nuances that people don't understand about charities, the first one is that a public charity, which is what the Clinton Foundation is a very different animal than the Gates Foundation, which is a private foundation. A public charity, by law and by regulation, must stand in the shoes of government. It cannot be a partisan political creature, and over its life, it cannot create more than an insubstantial amount of what is called private gain. And in the regulations, private gain is any kind of advantage or edge. It's not simply monetary compensation. So if you were, for example, to take somebody who happened to be the daughter of two of the people who were important in the foundation and then put that daughter into a position where she didn't get a salary, but she was able to hire her friends at above market rates and travel around the world in private jets, that is all private gain. And that is precisely what Bill and Hillary did with Chelsea. I mean, everybody loves their children, or most people love their children, but you can't take a child and promote her way above people who are 50 and 60 years old with many more decades of actual life experience and put them in charge of a public charity. But that's exactly what the Clintons have done. And the second piece is that while a lot of people focus just on IRS forms, Form 990 in the case of a true charity, or Form PF in the case of a private foundation, you also can look at state filings, which in certain states have much tougher requirements for disclosure. One of those states is California. In the case of California, a charity like the Clinton Foundation must disclose particulars of every government grant that it received from anywhere, not just from local government, state government, federal government, international government. Same is true in New York. The Clinton Foundation, its various arms, has never done that properly. Never done that properly. Moreover, if a charity receives more than I think it depends on the charity. I think it's about $750,000. It's got to procure a special type of audit of the government grants, and the Clinton Foundation has never done that either. So back when you and I were first talking about this, I was really focused on the Clinton Foundation from a numerical perspective because I'm not a lawyer. But in the intervening 10 years, I've gotten reasonably smart about the law. And the biggest element of this fraud, I believe, is that the Clinton Foundation doesn't technically exist as a legal matter. Now, why would I say that? You could go into the state of Arkansas, as I and colleagues have done, and you can request all their key legal documents. These, and I'm going to break a little news for you here. These documents show that on April 28th, 2005, an attempt was made by Bruce Lindsay, who is still involved with the Clinton Foundation, as a longtime consigliere for the family, to amend the Articles of Incorporation of an entity that was then called the William J. Clinton Presidential Foundation. But like many things Clinton, this effort was slapdash and haphazard. What they did is they just changed the first article of the Articles of Incorporation, but they did so in a sloppy fashion. Throughout, they changed it to read that the name of the organization is the William J. Clinton Foundation, striking the word presidential. But in the key original document, in that sentence, they defined the entity as the uppercase corporation. In this amendment, the new sentence, first of all, doesn't end with a period, so it's not grammatical, and it omits this definition of the corporation, while the balance of the Articles of Incorporation remain intact, using this term, the uppercase corporation, throughout. So it gutted the articles on April 28th, 2005, if the amendment is deemed to have been in full force and effect. The second change they made was a retroactive change. They only filed it with the federal government in 2006. They should have filed it in 2005 in both of these changes, because the way I read the IRS forms at the time, if you make a change before you file the document, you've got to disclose the change. So they should have made this change in connection with their 2004 filing, and they didn't. In 2006, or in connection with their, I think it was their 2006 990, I may have that wrong. Now, let me think about that. I don't have it in front of me. I think it was their 2006 990. They disclosed that they changed the document they filed in 2006. They disclosed the 2005 990. They disclosed that they amended the bylaws. And in the bylaws, they in the Clinton Foundation version, which is on their site, the bylaws are not attached to the 990, but in the one that is filed with ProPublica, the nonprofit explorer, you can see the real filing. And the real filing contains the amended bylaws, which at the top say amended and restated bylaws for the William J. Clinton Presidential Foundation, the original name. So whenever that document is handwritten, it says that it was amended on April 25th, 2005. All right? So that means that from April 25th, 2005, if that amendment actually was in full force and effect, this entity had changed its name, potentially, to a different name, but had bylaws that were different than the original bylaws, but still for the original name of the entity. So that's incredibly sloppy. And a lot of money, the bulk of all the money that passed through the Clinton Foundation, passed through it after April 25th, 2005. Roughly 90% has gone to the Clinton Foundation to date since that date, to an entity that doesn't legally exist. And none of these fancy donors, Bill Gates, the Rockefeller Foundation, all these fancy foundations, and all these major governments, none of these people noticed this obvious flaw, which is an obvious disqualifying flaw. And it means that the entity, there's a case law on this, and there's one case, I forget the name of it, which makes plain that a charity cannot be, quote, a formless aggregation of individuals, which is what this is. This is, Bill Clinton's fantasy. In his book, My Life, which was originally published in June of 2004, and then the paperback came out in 2005, around the time of this bylaw change, he talks about how he set up the foundation in New York by July of 2001. In no Clinton Foundation filing is there, in that period from 2001 until 2008 through 2008, in no Clinton Foundation filing is Bill Clinton listed as an officer, director, trustee of any part of the Clinton Foundation.
So it sounds like intentional, sorry to interrupt you, Charles. So it sounds like intentional charity fraud then, where they're not complying with all the laws that a regular person. So if you and me wanted to set up a charity, we'd have to do all these different things, cross our T's, dot our I's, fill out the forms, and then we might not get approved. We could get in a lot of trouble if we don't do things right. But here you have someone in a high level of government and probably also many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. They have law degrees, they have expensive lawyers, tax attorneys, tax accountants, and they know the legal loopholes to get around this stuff, to set up a fake charity, to get around campaign finance laws, and potentially get their friends and family members enormous extra payola, enormous extra pork on the side. This gets around a lot of the campaign finance laws and other stuff. If a corporation wants to donate to your foundation, if you're a member of Congress, you can the corporation can go way above campaign finance laws or bribes or other stuff. And this is how a lot of DC operates then?
I think so. And to be fair, I think the Clintons came late to this party. For a variety of reasons, I and a colleague, Jason Goodman, he runs Crowdsource the Truth and does various videos, many videos, including we do a show together on Wednesday and Sunday, New York time, in the evening. He had an issue with CPAC, which caused us to both look carefully at CPAC, and that's an organization whose roots date back to about 1960. And when you look at the filings of CPAC, in particular in the period 2008 and 9, when there was great trouble at the parent American Conservative Union, American Conservative Union Foundation, you see a nest of supposedly right-wing operations and foundations contributing to an organization which has the same sorts of problems as the Clinton Foundation concerning its legal existence, concerning its paperwork, concerning its audits. So the Clintons are wily. And back in 1992, after Jennifer Flowers, that episode nearly derailed his candidacy, they, according to a book authored by Don Van Natta and Jeff Girth called Her Way in 2007, they formed a war room to think through all of the potential scandals which might upset the Clinton apple cart. And then they trained all of their resources, their nefarious resources, against critics. This is a behavior that caused them to win in 1992. Do we really believe that once Bill Clinton became president of the United States that he was nonpartisan? Or do we think that he used the resources of the presidency and of the people he appointed to key positions in the CIA, the FBI, Department of Justice, IRS, to get as much dirt as possible about all of their potential opponents before, during, and potentially after his presidency? I, for one, believe they did exactly that. And so they were aware and remain aware of, let's just call it, frauds perpetrated by other Democrats, by Republicans, by independents. And they were very clever in the way they inserted themselves into the paid speaking arrangement fraud, the book fraud, and the business deal fraud. So what do I mean by that? Before Bill Clinton was on the speaking tour, very few people commanded the kind of speaking fees that he ultimately got. And it's not
They
as
were
if
six figures, right? Weren't they? They were like for hundreds of thousands of dollars or sometimes even millions of dollars.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be that to get a six-figure speaking fee, you had to really, do something extraordinary. But now it's just, morons get six-figure speaking fees. And one of the things that nobody's really gotten into yet, I haven't bothered to spoke into it either, is that when you get these high speaking fees, you deliver them by definition in a jurisdiction where you've got to pay local income tax. In most of these where there are local income taxes. Bill and Hillary have provided their federal tax returns, but they've never provided their local tax returns. And I question whether they paid local taxes in California, for example, or New York, when they gave a speaking fee. I question that.
Well, they also used to go to other countries and pick up checks too. I mean, there was a lot of shady stuff going on. Now, with respect to what the WikiLeaks Podesta emails, the USAID scandal, was the Clinton Foundation, when Bill Clinton left the White House and the Clinton Foundation started really ripping, were they one of the main ones in charge of what money laundering and moving around a lot of these USAID funds? Because Elon Musk has talked about this on the Joe Rogan show. He was saying that basically like the Soroses and the Clintons and some of the other major families, they've been doing this stuff for decades. Or some of the other people with the charity frauds, they'd give $10 million for lobbyists to buy politicians, and then the politicians would move what government budgets to like a non-governmental organization, say hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to this non-governmental organization, I don't know, to help needy kids in Africa. But then like the majority of the funds, 90% or more, would not go to the needy kids in Africa. It would end up for payroll and salary and God knows what else for these rich families.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's distinguish between grants by foreign governments and grants by American governments to these NGOs. And let's start with foreign governments. Under U.S. law, my reading is that and I think it's bright line, a U.S. charity that acts as an agent for a foreign government is not engaging in tax-exempt activities under the IRS rules, right? You can't be an agent of a foreign government. Yet, and that's when it comes to charities. In addition, if your spouse is a high-level government official, in particular the Secretary of State, you definitely cannot be an agent of a foreign government while your spouse is Secretary of State. Okay? Yet that's exactly what Bill claims he was in his various books. In his paperback edition of My Life in 2005, he begins to talk about his fight against AIDS, which I would argue is a theoretical fight only. It's a fight in name only. In Giving, a book that he, which I refer to as Taking, talks about in 2007, and in various speeches, he explains that the Clinton Foundation, in its fight against AIDS, didn't really have any money for that. And I would argue had no authority to do any activities outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. But what Bill did is he used his ties with then leaders and former world leaders to get rich governments to chip money into either directly into fights in poor countries against AIDS, or indirectly through an entity called UNITAID, which is a part of the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization and other multilateral agents. So he would say, listen, he'd go to get his people to go to an African country, and he'd say, listen, you've got an AIDS problem, right? And they'd say, yeah, we got an AIDS problem. Well, listen, I can get you some money. You give me some projects, you give me help on the ground, and I can get your government money. So the biggest known player to support Clinton Foundation efforts in the theoretical fight against AIDS is this entity called UNITAID. Take a guess how much money UNITAID has given that we know about to the Clinton Foundation to fight HIV and AIDS. Take a guess. The largest in their list of cumulative contributions that they put out, the highest category is 25 billion and above. Okay? Guess what UNITAID is?
They've given if this goes back decades, I mean, it could be hundreds of billions of dollars?
Millions, yes, $650 million. And they began this in 2006 at a time when the Clinton Foundation, I believe, had been turned down. They created a subsidiary making false disclosures to the IRS. There is no record that this subsidiary, Clinton Foundation HIV/AIDS Initiative, ever received authority, lawful authority from the IRS to fight HIV and AIDS in theory around the world. There's no record of that. And the strong suspicion is that it was turned down. It was rejected because it was so bad. So what did Bill do? He had forged this. The creation of UNITAID took many years to accomplish. So he had strong-armed the French government, which was the biggest contributor to UNITAID, into going down the path that they had to go down with the various nations that created UNITAID within World Health Organization. So this was well in progress, and he needed the authority. He didn't have it. So what did he do? He and Ira Magaziner and I think Bruce Lindsay and others just pretended that they merged this fake charity into the parent charity, which was also a fake charity at the time of the merger on December 31st, 2005. The HIV/AIDS thing had set up subsidiaries in numerous countries in Africa and elsewhere, illegally, falsely representing the status of the Clinton Foundation across national borders into many countries. And nonetheless, UNITAID sprang into creation before Hillary won re-election as senator in November 2006. UNITAID came together in September, right around the time of the fake Clinton Global Initiative, which is another thing we'll get to. And the original filings of UNITAID, which are still out there in the public domain, show that a majority of funds that the UNITAID gave in its early years went to this fake entity, which didn't exist. So how many people took a slice of that money? And at the time, the French election was in I think May of 2007. So how much of the money that originally was gifted or grifted to the Clinton Foundation may have been kicked back to the successful candidate Sarkozy for president in 2007? So this is an old game when it comes to international governments sending money into a crooked American politician with the understanding, wink, wink, that a portion of that money would go back to them. This has been going on for a long time. So that all of that activity, that corrupt activity, is expressly disallowed. Now, when we talk about NGOs inside the United States, an entity like the one that Stacey Abrams supposedly is associated with that doesn't really exist and whose principals have no experience, no relevant experience, should not get a penny, let alone $2 billion from the government. And if you're an NGO that has a majority of its support coming from the U.S. government, you're not an NGO. And, right, you're not a non-governmental organization if more than 50% of your funding comes from the government.
Well, it sounds like charity fraud to me, but like everyone around here in the DC Metro, I was telling you this before we started recording. I mean, I know on the dating apps, because I'm single, there would be a lot of women that had connections. Their parents or grandparents got them jobs, nepotism, and then they'd end up getting hired right out of undergraduate or graduate for an NGO. They didn't have a good resume, and yet they got this job, and they were making like way over $70,000 a year, sometimes over $100,000 a year, and getting all these other perks and stuff like that. And they're like, oh, I work at an NGO. Oh, I'm flying first class to this emerging market. Oh, I'm taking a private jet to a climate conference. Are these things, the NGO money, was it going through like shell companies? Is this why it's so hard to trace?
Well, so an NGO, if it is actually a charity, it has to file a lot of paperwork. And if it's getting government grants, it has to, in New York, lay out what's the name of the grantor, what was the amount for, what's the amount involved, and what was the purpose of the grant. It's got to be disclosed. And what I think has happened is that the Clintons and others figured out that you can write all the rules and regulations and pass all the laws you want, but the key issue is, will prosecutors prosecute you once crimes have been discovered? That's the key issue, and they have been abusing this discretion. You look at Merritt, I call him meritless fart man, Merrick Garland. While he was Attorney General, that man literally tortured 1,500 January 6th alleged protesters and ignored Biden family corruption, Clinton family corruption, Bush family corruption, Obama family corruption. It was outrageous. And that 4-year period alone demonstrates that when you have a corrupt, vindictive, and vicious person making the ultimate decision about who gets prosecuted, that a lot of mayhem can ensue. Both people who should have been prosecuted don't get prosecuted, and people who shouldn't have been prosecuted do get prosecuted. I think that's a clear message of what happened during the 4 very long years where people in Washington, D.C. were complicit in the fraud and conspiracy that presented Joe Biden as a mentally competent individual when he certainly wasn't. So the bureaucracy ran riot in those 4 years. When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State from January 21st, 2009 to February 1st, 2013, during much of that period, there was no inspector general at the State Department. The previous inspector general under W. Bush had been kicked out for alleged improprieties, and they never filled the post while Hillary was Secretary of State. In addition, USAID was normally a separate institution, and Hillary folded it into the State Department and put one of her cronies in charge of USAID. So
was that Powers or?
Not Samantha Power. It was I think it was Rajiv Shah or something like that. I forget the guy's name, but they put the Clintons are extremely adept at coaxing money out of donors and out of governments for these nebulous plans. Now let's get back though to another huge element of this fraud, and indeed the biggest piece of the Clinton fraud is not even the AIDS part, it's the Clinton Global Initiative. Now that was a bold and remains a bold shakedown cruise. There is no such entity as the Clinton Global Initiative, right? It in theory was controlled by the parent company, but that one doesn't have legal paperwork. So no subsidiary is a valid entity. And the Clinton Global Initiative is not even a true charity. It's a grift convention, a grifter convention. You get together. It started out in September, right around the time in New York of the UN General Assembly. So a lot of world leaders were already in town. It is a devilishly clever fraud, but it's a fraud nonetheless. So Doug Band, initially, the now disgraced founder of Teneo, whose criminal activities have not been fully exposed yet, in my view, worked with Jeffrey Epstein and with Bill Clinton to have this assembly in New York, where the Clintons, it was closed to the public. Now, a public charity cannot hold events that are closed to the public. You can't do that. You could conceivably do that maybe as a private foundation, but not as a public charity. So they hold these closed events, and they tell the money people, look, do you want a chance to rub shoulders over the course of 2 or 3 days with presidents of many countries around the world? And business people say, wait a minute, this is fantastic. If I can get a chance to speak to the leader of, you pick the country, then maybe I can get a chance to exploit oil and gas in that country or do a mining project or an infrastructure project.
Well, now it's green energy, right? So like when the Clinton Foundation started, they weren't as into the climate change, ESG, Green New Deal. I call it the energy spending grift scam. They weren't as much into that, but now like that's the one that's like hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. Most of the fake charities we've seen, Charles, come out with the DOGE news, the USAID news. There's a ton. There was like a high school Spanish teacher that was friends with people like in the government or something like that. And she got a 20 million contract for climate change. I mean, she's not a scientist, doesn't have any right. experience with energy or climate or anything like that, and still got a 20 million contract.
Well, let me just continue because I'll get to that. So the Clinton Global Initiative published verbiage and various press releases about its success in raising money. Now, they didn't, and I've been involved with charities, I'm sure you have too. Most people, when they give to a charity, give securities or cash, and that's the end of it. Some people will make a binding pledge to give money over a period of years. The Clinton Grifter Initiative conceived of this idea of a, quote, commitment to action. So that's, a step before a pledge. It's nonsense. And they wax eloquently about how these commitments to action would be studied and that milestones, and we measure how people do with them. These are not firm pledges. These are just, aspirational dreams. And starting after the one in 2005, they would brag about how they raised, I think, if you add all the money up, over $100 billion in commitments to action. And then when you look at descriptions of one of these commitments to action, I'll tell you this in this audio interview. One of them, if you can believe it, and women will be shocked by this, was for a commitment to action to assist African girls in the bush reusing menstrual pads. We didn't think about that.
It's is that fake? Did they actually do it, or was this like a fake thing?
I'm not a woman, so I maybe you would think about reusing a menstrual pad, but I don't think with AIDS flourishing and other issues, I don't think that makes any sense whatsoever. But they brag about it in one of the Clinton Foundation descriptions of one of the commitments to action. So when you really go through the various commitments to action, some of them are for investment funds, to raise a multi-billion-dollar investment fund in Africa. That is not charitable work. So this Clinton Global Initiative is a complete fraud. There's never been an accounting of it, which is required. New York has very strict laws, both the city and the state, that are stricter than IRS laws about, you can't, for example, in a charity, just decide that an initiative of the charity is a separate entity. You can't do that in New York.
They committing, sorry to interrupt you, are they committing money laundering and other like accounting fraud and other crimes besides just charity fraud? Then if they're moving funds around and they're buying off politicians, or they're involved in illegal, tons of illegal and felony activities in other governments. So that's basically they've set up, like, she had State Department protection at one point, because there was a bunch of employees, and this is just shocking too at the time when the WikiLeaks Podesta emails came out. You were telling me this, and they had like the emails back and forth intertwined between State Department and Clinton Foundation. So a lot of people were working at both at the same time, which is a big no-no for security clearance and blackmail issues here in the U.S.
Yeah, again, I'm not a lawyer, but if I sat down with a lawyer, I bet you I could come up with a very long list of crimes, actual crimes that are conspiracies, and then a conspiracy to cover up the crimes. And this makes Tammany Hall, which was a major league scandal back in the early in the last century. This makes Tammany Hall look like nothing, right? I mean, this is the idea that you would have all this money going across international borders, across state boundaries, using the internet, using other means, and that there's no accounting for it. And tens of billions, hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars are missing. And the rest of us are all paying taxes. This is absolute nonsense. And the biggest question, the Clinton Foundation has been investigated from February 2001 to an unclear point of time in 2005. The Clinton Foundation was under investigation by the FBI. You can see some of the evidence that they looked at. It's all redacted. It's not all the evidence that's online in the FBI vault on the William J. Clinton Foundation. You just Google it for yourself. There are 4 parts to that one. The FBI, for a time under Robert Mueller, had large teams of people from the FBI working with the IRS. There were grand juries convened. And for all the period that they looked at this, the Clinton Foundation never had a pretense of an audit, right? And it never had an independent audit. New York law, then prevailing and now prevailing, requires that a charity of the size of the Clinton Foundation must procure a truly independent audit, and that audit must be performed using generally accepted accounting principles consistently applied. I mean, there's specific language in New York law about this. And the Clinton Foundation said, fuck that. We're Bill and Hillary Clinton. Hillary's a senator. She's going to be the president. No audit. Fuck you.
Well, they got audits later, because you were telling me, for the archives, if the listeners want to go back and listen to our old interviews, I mean, you were telling me that there was like copies of reports attached to the emails in the WikiLeaks Podesta email dump that there were copies from what the accounting firm that the Clinton Foundation or others hired talking about audits and tens of millions of dollars missing at a time and how to cover it up. You were telling me that these are clear financial crimes and just no one bothered to prosecute anything.
That's at a later point in the chain. In the period October 23, 1997 through June 8th, 2006, there are absolutely no audits on file for the Clinton Foundation anywhere. For 2001, 2, 3, and 4, there are documents that were issued by an accounting firm that has since merged, formerly called BKD, that state on their face that they are not audits. These are non-compliant documents that were nonetheless tendered to the state of Massachusetts, to other states, I think in California, possibly to New York. But they are on their face non-compliant. On June 9th, 2006, BKD stepped the game up and tried to produce an audit. But given my training exposing fraud at General Electric, which is a lot more complicated, it was very easy for me to look at that first audit and say, you can check audits. You know about this. You have a financial background. If you have an income statement and a balance sheet and a statement of cash flows, you can cross-check and see, are there contradictions? In the case of the first audit, which covered the period January 1st or December 31st, 2003 to December 31st, 2004, December 31st, 2004 to December 31st, 2005, you can see that that audit and the Clinton Foundation management involved inflated the value of real estate to mask the theft of approximately $64 million out of a balance sheet of about 165. It's right there. You can see it if you know what you're doing with accounting. That gross fraud remains present in every subsequent financial statement of the Clinton Foundation. So there is a first one, June 9th, 2006, that makes a pretense of complying with requirements, but fails to do so. And every subsequent audit, including the most recent one for the year ended, I guess, 23. The year ended 24. We won't get that audit until likely November. Every subsequent audit is a fraud, and as is the first one. The thing you're talking about is that in 2008, the Clinton Foundation hired a woman called Kumiki Gibson, who's a Democrat partisan, to study the paperwork of the Clinton Foundation. And yes, you're right. In the Podesta WikiLeaks, her memo, which is shocking, was included as an attachment to one of these Podesta emails. And it just flat out says, the Clinton Foundation is not in compliance with law. The memo is addressed to Bruce Lindsay, who was then the chairman of the Clinton Foundation. So she highlights shocking problems with the Clinton Foundation. I think the memo is dated in 2008 from memory. And at roughly the same time, in December of 2008, December 12th specifically, the Clinton Foundation and the Barack Obama transition team signed a memorandum of understanding which described the Clinton empire of fake charities in glowing terms. Every single description in the memorandum of understanding is materially false and deceptive. Every aspect of it, materially false and deceptive. Either the Obama team did diligence, which I suspect they didn't. I suspect Obama had his own issues and own concerns, and was willing just to say, okay, fine, we'll take the Clinton Foundation, we'll take Hillary Clinton, we'll take that risk. But every single aspect in the memorandum of understanding, you can see it online. There are various versions of it. They're in the Podesta WikiLeaks. There's several versions. There's one that John Kerry provided to senators. Every aspect of the process to get Hillary Clinton confirmed as Secretary of State was a bold fraud. And some senators were concerned about the conflicts of interest that definitely happened while she was Secretary of State. So that whole process of confirming Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State was a fraud. And
The rumors I heard, Charles, sorry to interrupt you. Let me add to your points there. The rumors I heard was that after Hillary Clinton was already Secretary of State, a year and a half, something like that, that's when Obama found out, like that the Clinton Foundation, that she was using her protection at the State Department. They were double dipping with employees at both. And there was just a ton of money laundering and other nefarious things going on. And Obama was furious, but he decided to cover it up rather than, expose the truth and make himself look bad because he, didn't do the due diligence, like you said. Now, at the same time, too, when Obama was in the White House, I mean, you had the Biden family, too, involved in tons of shell companies and all this stuff, too. Biden was vice president. Now, he was known, the rumors that he was a drunkard, but he was also well known as very corrupt. So he was also setting up fake charities and setting up side deals and stuff like that too in Ukraine and other areas.
Yeah, the old "if you can't beat them, you join them." I mean, in ancient Europe, there was the Lord of the Manor had something called droit de seigneur, which means the Lord of the Manor had the right to sleep with any woman before her marriage. That's in essence what these politicians think they have. They have the right, they think, to fuck all of us. And I mean, the fraud in that memorandum of understanding, if they had, a once serious law school like Yale or Harvard Law School, Columbia Law School, should examine the confirmation process and the vetting process of Obama candidates in 2009. That could be a two semester course, just going through the corruption there. The people whose defects in their candidacies to be high-level cabinet officers were passed over, obscured, or covered up. Wholly incompetent people were made heads of cabinet departments and senior officials. But just going back for a second to why I'm so exercised about this, in that memorandum of understanding, there's one activity that is not discussed that happened on, I think, December 2nd. It was in Asia, so it was around the same time that Obama paraded his top picks to the press, Hillary Clinton being one of them. Bill Clinton was hosting an international version of the Clinton Global Initiative in Hong Kong, which supposedly 400 people attended. Now think if Donald Trump's family had done that in December of 2016. What would the press have said if Donald Trump was the incoming President of the United States and Melania had held a Trump Foundation gathering in Hong Kong, which then was part of Communist China? What would the press have said about that?
Well,
Bill did that.
I don't know if you've heard. Have you heard the rumors from Alex? Alex Jones has been saying this for years. I don't know if it's true. It's rumors, but he's like adamant that Bill Clinton was taking bribes from the Chinese Communist Party for trade deals and other stuff while he was in the White House. So Alex Jones has said that like he was making millions of dollars out bribes for that. So it doesn't surprise me what you just said, that like they set up another bribe system.
Right, but the point being, this is 2008. If you go into the Clinton history, as I've done, you'll see that his rise to power involves suspicious loans, suspicious business deals, suspicious ties with many different foreign governments while he was governor and eventually a presidential candidate and then president. So this goes back for a long time. You're telling me the FBI didn't know about this? I say bullshit. In fact, I have one book that's written by the former special agent in charge of the Little Rock office that talks about his final posting was to Little Rock. And it talks about how deep corruption was inside Arkansas when Bill was a candidate, governor and then candidate. So, I mean, people knew about this. And what Obama and Biden decided to do, rather than punish the Clintons, which is what I would have done, is they decided to emulate them. Joe's crooked money. He's the senator from MBNA. MBNA, credit card company. I mean, this is a guy whose family cannot justify its wealth in any way, shape, or form. Hunter Biden has a Crimea River letter going in now complaining that he's broke. He can't sell his art. He lost his home in the fire. He can't get speaking gigs. He can't get investment deals. So he's trying to get out of some lawsuit that he's going to be destroyed in.
That's probably not to pay child support. I mean, didn't he claim that stuff at the child support hearing too? Like in the last year or two, he claimed that stuff that he's broke too.
Well, Biden, Joe Biden, on his whenever he gets in trouble, he invokes the memory of Beau Biden, the son who died, who he claims was killed in Iraq when he wasn't killed in Iraq. And it's a tragedy to lose an adult child at the age that Beau passed away, and I feel for him for that. But don't exploit it, which is what he's tried to do. And then let's take a look at the Beau Biden charity. It's the same sort of grift mill. Money comes in, but nothing good comes of that money. And why, when you think today about the pressures in the private sector, the downward pressures on incomes because of AI and technology, giving a newly minted college graduate with a C+ average in environmental studies a $70,000, $100,000 job and letting that idiot fly around the world to attend climate conferences first class is preposterous. It is definitely not charity. The science around climate change is the original maker of the model. The original model claims that the model has been perverted since then. And Donald Trump rightly calls it a hoax.
Well, let's not dispute climate change here or there. Let's just focus that I think it's very clear though that a lot of these fake charities are being set up for climate change or green energy, but the people in charge of them have no science or energy or any type of technology background. Some of them there's congressman, a governor of Georgia with Stacey Abrams, didn't John Podesta, who was committing a bunch of crimes in the WikiLeaks Podesta emails, I mean, didn't he just get in the Inflation Reduction Act, if the reports are true, he got around $375 billion in a slush fund from the trillions of dollars spent on the Inflation Reduction Act only a couple of years ago. He was in charge of managing those funds.
It's ridiculous. And, in my experience, I went to a pretty challenging high school called Horace Mann in New York. And it started actually in 7th grade when I was there. I graduated in the class of 74. And starting in 7th grade, you were either in an honors class or you weren't. And the people around many of these charities and in politics are the very same people who didn't take a serious STEM class ever. Yet they are policymakers and advisors, and I call them think tanks, and even high-level cabinet positions. I mean, Joe's cabinet appointments are laughably absurd, starting with his vice president, who's a moron. You can't have a system where the government is borrowing $1 trillion a year, $2 trillion a year because of the deficits, and borrowing and spending into oblivion, and giving that money to entities that don't exist and have no accounting for what happened. The markets are not going to let you do that.
Well, Charles, eventually. It was even worse than that before Biden left. I mean, I had total spending around $8 trillion. The government was flush with tax receipts, a record amount around $5 trillion. So I had the budget deficits actually closer to $3 trillion as Biden was leaving out the door. And the reports are they stole everything they could, every last couple million, tens of billions, hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars were helped laundered out, it looks like, by Wall Street bankers at Citibank to set up these fake investment, either fake charities or fake green energy climate change investment funds.
Yeah, and so here's one simple fix. Bill pioneered at his foundation the idea that his foundation, its tax-exempt purposes were any damn project that he decided to pursue. Okay, that is not a charity.
Charity for Bill Clinton.
yeah, charity begins in his home. I mean, a charity is supposed to have carefully elucidated and specific tax-exempt purposes. That's a start. But before you get there, only organizations may become charities. So to be an organization, you don't just file incorporation papers for a nonprofit. Trustees, truly independent in the case of a public charity, Truly independent, meaning not affiliated Democrat or Republican, and independent. The charities have to have duties of loyalty and obedience and care. Loyalty to the organization. That is, means that if there's a conflict of interest between a trustee or a manager and the entity, they have to declare the conflict, and the interests of the charity must prevail. Obedience, the duty of obedience, means that you've got to obey all relevant law. So if you want to operate a DC charity in all 50 states and internationally, you've got to obey all relevant laws, not just DC law. And care, you can't have a charity where you've got an idiot pretending to be running it and not really understanding what Bill Clinton is doing in his penthouse apartment on top of a presidential library that you're not supposed to have. You can't do that. Okay? You're not being careful in your discharging your duties. So when you file the articles of incorporation, you got to make sure they're accurate, but you can't run the entity if it doesn't have bylaws. Bylaws lay out your organizational rules. The Clinton Foundation has never complied with the requirement to provide, when they amend articles or bylaws, what are called conformed copies. The IRS requires that you make those public. And there's a good reason for that, because a conformed copy, if you just file a certificate of amendment, you may miss the fact that the attempted amendment guts the integrity of the articles or the bylaws. That's why you have to go and change every aspect, make sure you can go over it. And they didn't do that. Okay, so the thing doesn't exist. So a starting point, Musk is now looking into the question of whether government employees exist. He also needs to look into the question of whether the entities actually exist. Well, because I think many of them don't. Sorry for that interruption. What I was talking about is that Elon Musk is now, he's checking to see whether these government employees truly exist, whether Social Security recipients truly exist. Now what he has to do is check and see that all the claimed charities that have received money, and you can figure that out. You don't even need government resources to do that. You can go on the ProPublica Nonprofit Explorer, and you can see the identities of all entities that have received money, 5,000 or more, from donors. You can figure that out. And then you just go and say, does this entity actually exist? In the case of the Clinton Foundation, there are many donations claimed by donors to entities theoretically associated with the Clintons that don't exist. I found one, for example, there was one donation to Harvard, the place I went to business school there, and I didn't recognize the address that was listed for Harvard University in a form that was carried out for an entity that has donated to the Clinton Foundation. On this form, that entity claims that it gave money to Harvard University in an address, and I called Harvard to check, that is not in any way connected to Harvard University.
So they didn't expect anyone to check then. So right. they just wrote Harvard, but the money ended up somewhere else, probably in someone else's pocket or something.
Exactly. So this, that's what accounting for. What I was running, reasonably small firms at the end of my active days in business, but we had audits, and the auditors checked. You had to, provide, details concerning your revenues, and then they would go and check. Did you really send money to this entity? They send out what are called confirmation letters on revenues, expenses, on balance sheet items. People and this is for, in my case, a relatively small entity. So,
and that's a legit audit, unless you're auditor shopping, like say the Madoff Ponzi scheme or Enron or stuff like that. Right. But yes, for a legit audit, it's like you described.
Right. Well, and remember, just because it's nonprofit doesn't mean that there isn't fraud. I think we're discovering that nonprofit fake organizations are the perfect vehicle for fraud.
Well, I know you spent. Yeah. Here in the DC Metro, I can tell you, Matt, almost all of the politicians, high-level government officials, if they're debating getting back into government later, they'll set up a charitable foundation. They'll set up a lobbying firm. That stuff is getting commingled. I don't think that stuff is being looked at carefully at all. There's just so much money laundering, shell companies, charity fraud, they might not even be real charities. But if they are real charities, I mean, in most cases, Charles, if they go through the process of actually setting up the charity, then still what I think legally they're only required to give 10% to the needy people. So if they raise the funds, 90% might be spent on what salary and travel.
No, that's not correct. That's
That's not
at
correct.
all. Absolutely
Okay.
not correct.
Okay.
It's much worse than that. First of all, if you set up a legitimate charity, the guideline is that 85% of that charity's revenue should go to the tax exempt purpose, the specific tax exempt purpose, and only the specific tax exempt purpose of the charity. The 15% that's left over could be used for overhead and administrative expenses and fundraising expenses, but 85% is meant to go to the tax exempt purpose. And you can't say that my tax exempt purpose is paying for Chelsea's wedding. I mean, it has to be, or employing people that the Clinton family would otherwise have to pay out of their own pocket in connection with their various undertakings, their political campaigns, or managing their mansions. You can't do any of that in what are called the program service expenditures. The program service expenditures must be for the tax exempt purpose, and that's what auditors are supposed to check. But I think what's going on in DC, I know because I've tried to get paperwork, trying to get the original filing, the incorporation documents, which you're supposed to provide, that are similar to the Form 1023 IRS form at federal level, you're not going to get them out of DC because DC is a swamp. And this is the one trick that is enriching people in both parties in that very expensive place. So nobody wants Musk or anyone, myself included, to look at that DC paperwork. If you got that paperwork, you would be able to imprison probably 80% of Washington, D.C. that's involved in politics.
And sadly, it's true. Yeah, most of Congress. I mean, like that's how you see, Charles. What the average salary for congressional is what $180,000 a year. It's a very expensive cost of living here in the DC metro area. How do you get to how do you get to like $10 million net worth in not that long in Congress? I mean, it's just people like, how did they do it? And my answer is a lot of it's like bribes and charity fraud.
Exactly, and then you get as well to these fact checkers, right? Hillary is fond and Bill is fond in defending the Clinton Foundation and saying, well, we've gotten a 5-star rating from Charity Navigator and there's some other firms like that. Go look and see how big those firms are. These are firms that charge small amounts of money and get, in some cases, they're charities that are run by tiny bands of people, most of them partisan. So they don't have the resources. I mean, I spent 10 years looking at the Clinton Foundation at my personal expense, right? Most people would not do that, right? And the IRS has investigated the Clinton Foundation. There is a matter before tax courts. There's a group called the at CFWBERS, lowercase BERS, at Clinton Foundation Whistleblowers on X. They have some disclosures. Much of their lawsuit is under seal, so they can't talk about that. But there are some matters that are that you can talk about publicly, and they do have a link on that Twitter handle to resources where you can see for yourself. They started on this trail of exposing the Clinton Foundation legally via lawsuits in 2017, and the IRS has been fighting them ever since. Why would the IRS resist looking into fraud at foundations of this magnitude? It's because the IRS is crooked, and it's deeply partisan. In my work, I have uncovered with others examples of fake communications issued in theory by the IRS, which are not real. Forgeries that are passed off to try to defend what the Clinton Foundation is doing. You would think that people at the IRS would care about that, and the Justice Department. Certainly taxpayers do. And the thing that the Clintons have missed here, when I was exposing General Electric, just again as one guy, and then in upstate New York originally, people would say, how are you going to take on General Electric? They're a gigantic company. I said, the ocean of public opinion will turn against them. And when it does, GE will suffer. And that's exactly what happened to GE. In GE's case, it took me about 2 years. The Clintons, this is not just the Clintons. This is the Bushes, the Obamas, the Bidens, it's Republicans, it's Democrats, it's independents. It's how Washington, D.C. makes its money and the suburbs in Virginia and Maryland. A lot of people stand to be exposed here. And so a lot of people are doing their level best to obstruct the investigation. But people are furious across the country now. There's this idiot you probably see on television called Caddy K, great name for an idiot, from BBC, who was on television in the last 24 hours saying that Elon Musk and DOGE are not popular in the heartland. It's a fucking moron.
I mean, people now online, because they can't hide everything on social media anymore. Although if Kamala Harris had won, there were rumors that they were going to use censorship, artificial intelligence software to try to either deplatform people or control all the news stories or get people fully demonetized. Thankfully, that did not happen. I mean, with artificial intelligence software and search and social media now, someone can break a story like you. The stories that are available now, you can't fully shut everything down anymore. Look at like the Ian Carroll guy, the Joe Rogan show. Joe Rogan's interviewing these whistleblowers, not just Elon Musk. The stuff is starting to get out there that 10 years ago I
Right.
didn't think so. I seriously thought that like my YouTube channel was gone 10 years ago. Like literally I went from 300,000 or 500,000 views per month down to zero. I was making $1,000 a month in ad revenues that got taken down to zero. It started to come back a little bit, but it's never gotten anywhere near those levels again. I thought like YouTube was going to fully shut me down when I was interviewing you about the Clinton Foundation. Now here we are, Charles, we're talking about hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions of dollars.
Right.
I actually ran some of the stuff you said with USAID fraud, Clinton Foundation through the artificial intelligence software Grok 3 because it has like a deep research feature. That's the software. And it actually put out estimates saying it thinks that based on all the decades of charity fraud and the other stuff, it said between 4 trillion and 6 trillion estimates now have been stolen.
Well, you see, it's deeper than that, right? So take, for example, Bill Gates. And I don't know if these rules remain the same, but in the old days, Bill Clinton, before Bill Clinton and his administration changed this rule, if you had $5 original investment in Microsoft stock that was then worth $1 million, in the old days, all you could deduct if you gave that stock to a charity was $5. Bill Clinton changed that and said no, and I think it's a good idea to change it. You can deduct the fair market value of the stock at the time of donation. So something that cost you $5 rather, is now worth $1 million. You could take a tax deduction of $999,995 against your personal income. And if Gates lived, I don't know if he still does, in Washington state that doesn't have a personal income tax, but if you happen to be a New York investor with that fortunate circumstance, you could deduct over time all of that gain against your income and save yourself a boatload of taxes. And the rub is, if you're Bill Gates and you give that appreciated stock to a charity whose affairs you still control, you get the tax deduction at federal level, but you still control the stock through your foundation. So you really haven't given a gift, I would argue. If you're in a senior leadership role in that charity, it's just gone from one pocket into a different pocket, and the government's writing you checks.
So you moved from paying taxes on your equity ownership, you moved it to a foundation, so you have control of the company, and you're in a nonprofit now.
Right. In my liquid Microsoft stock, I'm talking about now.
So that's also how like the Rockefellers and Rothschilds moved a lot of wealth off, and they don't have to report their real net worth. So.
Well, and then there's another rub there. So many of the big media empires, the biggest book publishing houses, for example, are controlled by European foundations. So when you look carefully at the U.S. book publishing grift, Kamala Harris has supposedly gotten a book deal where she's going to make a lot of money. I mean, Kamala Harris can barely read a first grade book. See spot run, jump spot run. I mean, she's an idiot.
Well,
Nobody.
look at the bribes from the other people of the past with those book deals to what Obama got 50 million from Netflix. They got book deals. Didn't
Right.
James Comey, he wrote a book
Yeah.
about like his time at the FBI. I think he got $1 million advance. Like they're just getting insane amounts of money on advances.
Right. And when you talk to people, my former father-in-law is actually still alive. I just saw him in Europe at a wedding. He's 94, and he's this very successful history professor, a sterling professor of history at, I forget the name, but a chair, a named professor of history at Columbia University, formerly a great university. His books, he said, if you sell a nonfiction book, if you sell 50,000 copies of a nonfiction book, that's good. The average book goes for about 5,000 copies. Who in the hell is buying millions of copies of books by Hillary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton and Bill Clinton? Who is actually going to the bookstore to buy those books? I challenge that those books actually sell at the levels they claim to be sold. And then you read some of these. I have about, I'd say, 100 books by political figures that I've been perusing. Very few are well written. Most of the formulas you get a ghostwriter, and it's just a travelogue. I met with the Prime Minister of India. It was hot. There were flies buzzing around, and I enjoyed the dancing and food. I mean, it's like that is not a riveting read, you know. And so these publishing houses, there's been great concentration in the publishing industry globally. There I think, 2 or 3 supremely important book publishers. Some of those are controlled by foundations. One of which
Hardly anyone reads full books anymore anyway, unless it's like an audio book. I mean, like Obama got a bribe from Netflix. I think it was like 50. He was supposed to have a talk show, and I don't think he ever did the talk show. He got like $50 million and put on the board at Netflix, I think.
Well, let's talk about his foundation. I mean, his foundation, the paperwork was put in by Bob Bauer to incorporate this thing in late January 2014 while he was still president. And initially it said, when he sought and got approval quickly from the IRS to be a presidential library foundation, the application said that the entity was going to store books and records created during the Obama president in a purpose-built facility funded by, not by the National Archives or by the government, but by donors. That's the basis upon which he sought, or people around him sought and received exemption from federal and later state taxes. Along the way, somebody came up with a genius idea, particularly with all the furor over Hillary Clinton's missing emails. Somebody said, you know what we better do? Let's take all those records ourselves, and we will digitize those records. And the records will not be available to the public, just the digital version of all these records. That's not a presidential library. The National Archives could do that, right? I mean, there's no reason to have this monstrosity out there in what was once protected land. That was, I think there were conservation easements on the land where this monstrosity is now going to sit. It's been years. It's been 11 years since 2014. The thing is not finished yet. And it's morphed from being a place where presidential records would be available, physical copies would be available, into this platform for Michelle and Barack Obama and their cronies to swan around the world giving prizes and having conferences. And this is not a charity. This is a political movement funded by the taxpayer and people who think they can get something back because Obama is still, even now, a revered figure. So
didn't it just came out? He set up another charity. It just broke over the Twitter newswire. There was copies of the documents published. They found another fake shell company. Wasn't it with the Bidens and the Obamas? I think were another fake climate charity. Like it's a shell company. It's not registered. There's at least $1 billion or $2 billion in there. The Bidens set up also like a fake cancer one for $2 billion. It's just shocking the stuff that's coming out.
Right. And so, everyone, and myself included, I'm one of the people who feels that the rot on Wall Street, the corruption on Wall Street and across the country has not been addressed the way it needs to be addressed. There still are, unfortunately, examples of companies raising money on false pretenses, of people insider trading it. So, and the conditions Well, the causes of the 2007 to 9 crisis have not been addressed. Well, let's think about who was the head of the SEC under Biden. It was Gary Gensler, a classmate of mine at Harvard Business School. I didn't like him then, and I haven't liked him since, and I particularly don't like what he did at the SEC. But he was the campaign finance chairman for Hillary Clinton in 2016. You're going to try to tell me that Gary Gensler doesn't know, about all of the laws that the Hillary Clinton campaign broke, rigging the 2015-16 Democratic primaries, and then attempting to rig the 2016 election. And then afterwards, while Trump was president the first time, using every means available, legal and not, to hobble the Trump presidency. You're telling me Gary Gensler didn't know about that? Joe Biden didn't know about that?
Well, Gensler is former Goldman Sachs too, and then he's friends with Podesta and those guys. But the interesting thing, I mean, everyone's saying he's anti-crypto, but didn't he approve FTX? And FTX was heavily involved. What they were using customer funds, they were doing a ton of money laundering to fake charities in the DNC too. Like Sam Bankman-Fried's parents were directly involved in this, and no one's charged them with anything.
Well, now he's sharing a cell with Diddy. I wonder how that's going. But literally sharing a cell with him.
He just Sam Bankman-Fried just did an interview on Tucker Carlson's podcast, and he said that he's friends with Diddy.
I don't doubt it.
Well, probably asking for pointers on money laundering.
Well, I think the idea that Sam is in prison but his parents are not is ridiculous. Sam Bankman-Fried is a moron. And there is absolutely no way he did everything that he claims he did without the help of his parents, who were both law professors at Stanford, or were.
Bingo.
And were both prominent Democrat activists. So, this has gotten, we are, for the main, when we look at charity fraud, what we're addressing so far, under Trump, under Obama, under past presidents, are the small fish. There was a congressperson who was sent away for a prison term, but then when COVID happened, she was let out for $1 million. The scale of these charity frauds, we're in the many tens of billions, hundreds of billions, maybe trillions when you count everything together going back over time. And these people, like Mark Elias is one example. I mean, Trump just, he had an executive order where he stripped the security clearances of people at Covington and Burling for their role in the Jack Smith escapade against common sense and decency. He just recently did the same thing to Perkins Coie. But what he needs to do, Mark Elias was such a bad actor that he may have been kicked out of Perkins Coie, but he left anyway to form his own firm. That firm needs to be sanctioned, and Mark Elias, needs to be sanctioned. He was centrally involved, both in the actual rigging of the Democratic primary cycle, 2015-16, which happened, and the fact that Bernie Sanders, never complained about that tells you just how dirty he is too. I mean, had I been Bernie Sanders, I would have sued the living shit out of everybody who rigged those primaries. I would have been relentless.
Well, it sounds like a Godfather type deal, like was made for him, like a Don Corleone, like from the Godfather movie. It was an offer he couldn't refuse. Basically, if he didn't take the money, bad things were going to happen. That's what the rumors I've heard.
Fine, you need to stand up to bullies, and so anyway, the system really needs to be fixed, and I hope that Trump does what needs to be done here. Back in the 2016 campaign. I did a lot of interviewing. The most exposure I got was on progressive radio. I was on progressive radio in some cases every day for an hour, nonstop, talking about Clinton Foundation fraud. And I was on Fox as well, the right and left side. I was on WBAI talking about it. That's almost a communist radio station, but they didn't like what the Clintons did in Haiti, nor should any sane person like what they continue to do in Haiti. And now exploiting Ukraine. But Trump in his final video of the 2016 campaign, it was all about the Clinton Foundation and how corrupt they were. And that was resonating. I think that theory, and I think suspicion and fact, resonated and is a contributor to why she lost in 2016. But then the day or so after the election, days after the election, Trump was asked as president-elect, are you going to do something about Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation? And he said, no, in America, we don't go after our political opponents. That's what he said. Well, shame on him. Because Hillary didn't get that message.
He couldn't get at that time in his first term. He had a lot of his political appointees blocked, especially like in the middle management ones. So there's no way. There was tons of government employees here in the DC area that were leaking stories like crazy. I mean, people were leaking any type of information that they could get, like luxury box suites at the or concert tickets. Like government employees were leaking like insane amounts of stuff to the media for extra cash tips or nice stuff. Like it was just, there was no way. My point sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. My main point though was that like there was no way he could get anything really, really good of substance done, because he didn't really understand how the system worked, how corrupt it was with the bureaucracy and getting the government agencies to do what he want, which is why he brought in what kind of an outside agency with Elon Musk. And a lot of the stuff is being done, Charles, with software. It's artificial intelligence software that's doing a lot of the stuff, that's doing kind of the auditing that you used to do. You can program the artificial intelligence software to do a lot of the search queries and check the bank account information. Is this Harvard address? Is it a dummy address? The software can do a lot of this. You don't have to go through all these corrupt middlemen government employees.
That's good. I'm delighted. In some ways, I'm delighted that we had the intervening 4 years, even though it cost this country so grievously under Biden, because the contrast between Trump in 2025 and Biden from January 20th, 2021 to 2025 is so stark. I mean, what in the hell was the Biden cabinet actually doing? I mean, it seems to me not much.
Stealing like everything that wasn't nailed down.
Right, but I mean, they weren't actually working. Right? I mean,
they were working for self-enrichment. They weren't working for you and me, the taxpayers. So the everyday American that wanted, a normal life, not that much inflation, the economy to improve, they weren't doing stuff like that. I mean, they were like negotiating like side deals, self-enrichment.
Right. All of that needs to be policed. And people like Elizabeth Warren and, whose net worth is rumored to be $87 million. How do you get a net worth of $87 million as a nitwit? I mean,
which committees? Tell me which committee she's on, and I'll tell you which corporations are hooking her up.
But still, how does that money, how do you have a net worth of $87 million? Let's see your tax returns, for starters.
Well, you set up a fake charity or a foundation, you put your family and friends on there, and then you make sure that you have friends in the key places, like you said earlier in the interview, in the Department of Justice and the tax authorities. And if you have that installed, the Clintons showed the way, and you have all these other politicians, and it's not just Democrats, there's corrupt Republicans too in Congress, and they've all learned that basically if you keep your mouth shut and you approve governments, this is why there's no huge cuts in the government spending. It's always like almost all the spending, the government budgets and stuff, there's always way more money spent because they're all looking for side deals to steal money or siphon it off to friends in the like corrupt corporate bailouts and other deals.
Right. Now you raise a good point. So one little trick on charities is the biggest slice of the fraud is money that somebody sends towards the charity but never reaches the charity. Okay?
Oh.
Take Haiti as an example. Credible estimates suggest that $10 to $13 billion were sent towards Haiti to repair the damage caused by the earthquake in January 2010. 10 to 13 billion. In Haiti, there's no evidence that money actually reached Haiti. So where did it go? Now, if some of it went to a Elizabeth Warren, or to, let's say, Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, and reached her personal account, or is given to her in the form of real estate in Ireland or Panama or Dominican Republic or somewhere, that's income. And if it's not declared on her tax return, which it wouldn't be, You can't say, what are your sources of income? Corruption, money laundering. It's a dangerous
Well,
thing to
these
declare.
things are tough to track down, though, Charles, because, and we saw this with Hunter Biden. I think one of the reasons he got in financial trouble with the tax authorities is he had so many shell companies set up, he mixed them up and couldn't keep track of them. So you have humans, right, trying to figure out all these different shell companies, and if the corrupt politicians and high level government officials or lobbyists or whatever are moving money from one shell company to another back and forth before it ends up in its final destination. I mean, that's a lot of work. We know this from some of the stuff that came out in the Panama Papers, right? With some of the shell companies, with like George Soros and some of the others. You really have to
Right.
piece these things together with the information in the books, what in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, the stuff that you
Right.
talked about with the WikiLeaks Podesta emails, the stuff we know about Hunter Biden. You have to and then the last stuff with USAID, and then the whistleblowers. You have to piece all these things together to try to figure out. But the average human, like if you hire an investigator, it's a ton of work to track down all these shell
Right.
companies.
Right. Well, so when I was working on Wall Street, it was a firm no longer exists called Dillon Reed. It was a very conservatively managed place. I wanted to set up, I owned some land, and I wanted to set up a land development company. I had to get the approval of the vice chairman of Dillon Reed to open up a company, one company. If I went to that guy and said, now I want to open a second company, a third company, and 10 companies, whatever, at a certain point, he would say, "What, do you work for this firm, or are you a real estate magnate? I mean, what's going on here?" In Congress, in the Senate, in the federal government, you should not be allowed to open a shell company so long as you're a public servant. Can't do it. If you have holdings that are material that need to be managed, put them into a blind trust. And then that needs to be regulated by a department. And if the people in the regulatory branch are crooked or gamed, they need to go to prison for 40 years. Hard time. I mean, you need to have some real. You can't say that. I'm a part-time senator. You're a public servant.
Well,
You're going to
Nancy Pelosi's part-time in Congress, full-time hedge fund manager. I mean, she's outperforming all the other stuff, but at this point, she doesn't even really need charity fraud. But you have so many in Congress doing this stuff. I mean, the stuff that's coming out with DOGE is nuts. All the audits and stuff, and they're not even doing full line item like a full audit. They're just checking that the funds that were wired in the bank accounts, like you said with Harvard, it says it went to one place, the account is a different number and it's in another place. That's all they're doing. They're not even doing a full audit line by line, and they're already finding this much fraud.
Right. Well, yeah, but in the case back on Congress, I think I don't believe. Not only do I think that that you should be subject to insider trading laws, I think that sitting elected members of our government at whatever level should not be allowed to buy or sell individual stocks. You just shouldn't be allowed to do that. There should be a list of funds that they can invest in that are general purpose funds that are diverse, many holdings, et cetera. But I exclusively pick, buy and sell individual stocks, but I'm trained to do it, and it's a big job to do it properly. To do your job as a senator or a member of Congress while you're constantly buying and selling stocks, your husband's doing, that's bullshit. You shouldn't be allowed to do that. Public service.
It's happening all the time. Not just stock trading and stuff like that. I mean, information about like drug approvals and
Sure.
government contracts. All this information is being bought and sold. Like Stevie Cohen, the hedge fund billionaire, the guy who owns the New York Mets, he didn't get in trouble for this. I think he just paid a fine. But one of his underemployees was caught on recording buying information from, I think, FDA employees. What about drug approvals? They knew months in advance. They had like people on the payroll at the government agency. So I mean, like this stuff is just out of control with the corruption.
I agree. And examples need to be set here. One great example would be to march Bill Hillary and Chelsea Clinton into a courtroom and into prison. That would send quite a message.
Sorry, we're almost 90 minutes here. I'm getting tired because I did another interview a couple hours ago.
Sure.
So we'll wrap this. we'll wrap this up and we'll have to have you back on again in the not too distant future because we're getting disclosures about the Department of Government Efficiency. It's almost every day, Charles, that this stuff is coming. It seems like every day or two, it's many billions of dollars. It's just shocking.
Yeah, well, it's about time. Let's see that money. Not only should the level of spending in 2025 should drop, but monies that were sent incorrectly to fraudsters going back over a long period of time need to come back to the American taxpayer to reduce our debt. And that will poll at least 80% favorable. At least. Let the Democrats stand up and some rhino stand up and say, we don't want to investigate fraud. Let them do that.
People's lives are being ruined, though, from all this inflation, right? Their standard of living is being crushed from the government spending all this money and then raising taxes on them. The private sector, if you own a small business, rules, regulations, red tape, all these other things. But then, like, if the government is that corrupt and it's taking like bad contracts, you have a situation with the air traffic controller, in the control towers at the airport, and they either don't have enough human beings or they're using software with like old air traffic controller software. I don't know if you saw any video.
Yeah,
it was a corrupt contract. They didn't upgrade the software because it was a bribe and corruption. They're using software that's 3 or 4 decades old with dots on it, and then human beings die in a plane crash.
Right. I mean, one positive thing to think about. First of all, the team has only been in place for about 45 days, right? So monumental progress in 45 days, I would argue. Not even contrasting it with history, just it's an amazing amount of progress has happened. The corporate income tax in the United States collects, I think, less than 500 billion. Last I checked, it was a number of years ago, it was 250. If Donald Trump in this next tax bill said, what we're going to do? We're going to eliminate the corporate income tax and we're going to lock it in for, a period of years. And then the amount of money that would come back, capital that would come back into the United States would be denominated in the tens of trillions of dollars. You would wipe out the Cayman Islands. You would wipe out the Bahamian tax shelters and Mauritius and Dublin and Dubai and all that kind of stuff. A whole lot of money would come back into the United States if investors believed that those rules would stay in place for a long period of time. And I hope that's something that the Trump administration puts in place, because that would be fantastic.
But it sounds like we need to put some type of laws on the books with the shell companies, because it's a shocking amount, the stuff that's coming out with DOGE lately, and it's all these politicians. It's the governor of Georgia, Stacey Abrams. There's underlings that that have no experience with technology or energy or climate change or anything. Not even scientists getting $20 million contracts. These people are setting up Charles, are these people like setting up shell companies? Do you think they got corrupt lawyers or corrupt tax attorneys or tax accountants to help them set up shell companies, and then the funds got moved into there, and then they're going to end up getting, they're going to get jobs or something like that. While Trump's in the White House, then, and Republican, they're going to try to wait this out until the Democrats are back in Congress?
No, I think these grants need to be canceled and rescinded, and retrieved. Again, you can't, go back to the essence of a charity. A charity has to be a formal organization, right? It can't be, let's say, my lifelong dream was to win Wimbledon. You can't set up a charity to, pay for people to teach me how to win Wimbledon and travel tennis. That's ridiculous. It's not a charity. And so is setting up a charity by some underling who's never run anything to study an issue that is already being studied at various and sundry places. This is just fantasy land. And it just, people need to just go systematic. Fortunately, there are lists of charities. You need to take the biggest ones. And take Harvard as an example. Harvard has a gigantic endowment. Is Harvard an educational institution, or is it a hedge fund that enriches the administrators, the professors, who are given a cushion in their personal lives by getting the salaries and maybe the housing benefits that they get, as they also go on the boards of hedge funds and private equity operations and companies? This is preposterous. Educational institutions were given protection because the theory was that it was an important function educating the population. And the process of education and study is oftentimes has nothing to do with making money. So that was the theory. But Harvard's business school, where I went, Harvard's law school, Harvard's medical school, these are money spinning enterprises. In the case of the medical school, not only do the students get subsidies, to pay for their tuition, but various arms of our government, Harvard runs at least one hospital, get huge, billions of dollars from our government. So, we should be thinking about these big entities. And Harvard doesn't police, carefully enough, professors. There's one who died, Paul Farmer, who ran around claiming that he was in charge of the Harvard AIDS initiative. When I contacted Harvard to ask them about that, they had no record of it. So there's low-hanging fruit here to get. And I think the overwhelming majority of Americans who give to charities are the lower and middle income people. They're not the rich. And these sorts of people, they primarily give to their religious organization, their local temple, their church, whatever. And they are participating in those activities so that they can figure out whether they're fraudulent or not. So sadly, there are many religious entities that are fraudulent. But the charities that operate in their community tend to be, as a suspicion, less fraudulent, more lawful than ones that are based in D.C. or New York or whatever and claim to be operating in 50 countries around the world. Who is actually going to check that? You've got, in the case of the Clinton Foundation in New York, you've got multiple offices in New York City, which is always a warning sign. You should never have multiple offices in the same city. It doesn't make any sense.
There's also the huge connection, too, between the former president of Harvard, Larry Summers, who was in the Bill Clinton Treasury Department. He was friends with Bill Clinton, friends with Bill Gates, friends with Jeffrey Epstein. He's on the board of directors at OpenAI. So there's like a lot of shadiness there, too. But yeah, I agree with your points about the capital that these universities have raised with the endowment funds. I mean, they've turned into more or less hedge funds. And then like the student loan debts, people are bankrupted like financially if they don't get a good high paying job to pay back their student loan debts. So basically they're indentured servants or serfs, and then they're getting brainwashed with in many cases like a bad degree, woke, useless culture. They're getting brainwashed with a bunch of bad ideologies instead of being a productive member of society and the economy.
I agree.
Well, Charles, we've been speaking for 90 minutes. I am so tired right now.
Okay.
Are you still writing a newsletter right now, or what are you doing for?
No, unfortunately, my father died in June of 2023, and I had to do a lot after he died to straighten things out. Things went wrong. There was a lot of work I had to do, and then I moved out of New York to Malaysia. So I've been extremely busy getting resettled, but now I am resettled and I have a functioning office and personal office here. And I was actually working on a new edition of the newsletter before we went on air. So
that's excellent. Yeah, I think you set up a Substack. I'm not sure the last time you updated it, but you're very, very active on Twitter. You're posting like a lot of these stories showing additional amounts of the charity fraud. I think what the average person doesn't understand is to tie this stuff back. You have to put the pieces of the puzzle together, as you've been doing for over 10 years now. So it's reading Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It's going through some of the summaries of the WikiLeaks Podesta emails. Then you have what the Panama Papers, right, that came out that showed how the rich people like the George Soroses and the others set up their shell companies and the charity fraud, the stuff with Hunter Biden, and now the stuff with USAID and the whistleblowers that are coming out without Mike Benz and what Elon Musk are talking about. When you put all these things together, you start to understand just how crazy all this fake charity fraud and the grift is. And we're talking like many, many billions of dollars per year for decades.
Right. Well, I'd add a few things to that list. Charities, U.S. charities, and indeed most foreign charities, have to file paperwork first with, the Secretary of State, the equivalent of the Secretary of State. In England, it's called Companies House. You got to file papers just proving that you exist as an entity. And then with the charity regulator, in the UK, it's called the UK Charity Commission in England. you have to file separate paperwork there. In America, you've got to file paperwork with in the state or territory or city where you organize. You've got to file paperwork there. You've got to report in any place that you're soliciting funds inside America. There are many of the states. Most states have additional paperwork that you have to file each before you solicit, and then reporting on your solicitation. And then if you're an American charity like the Clinton Foundation, based in New York City, you have to register each alias name that your charity uses. So if your real name of the Clinton Foundation is the William J. Clinton Presidential Foundation, and you want to use any other name than that in New York City, you've got to register in advance to do that. Of course, they didn't do that. And then if you operate, there's a lot of paperwork that you can get that's available principally online. You don't have to wait for Freedom of Information Act stuff. That's one thing. The second thing is there are a lot of books that these grifters have written. The Clintons, written, I think Hillary's written 11 books. I forget how many Bill has written. And if you go back and you look at what they're bragging about having done in these books, and then re-examine the public filings, Bill and Hillary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton have basically confessed to charity fraud in their published works. Chelsea Clinton, for example.
Is that brazen? Is that brazen?
Yeah, and Chelsea, for example, is on the board of a publicly traded company, a large one that Barry Diller, I think, is involved with. And she's built up a nice paper profit on the stock that she was granted as a director. The problem for her is that the description and then the company that she's a director of has publicly traded securities. They describe her falsely. Her role in the Clinton Foundation, I had hoped that she would be a decent person, but I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree in her case. The descriptions of her experience at the Clinton Foundation are just factually incorrect.
Isn't she married to George Soros' nephew?
Is he Soros' nephew?
I think she's married to one of the relatives of another billionaire. I can't remember which one.
Yeah, I don't think Soros' nephew. But anyway, the point is that her disclosures about her charitable activities appear in the proxy statement. And a shareholder of that company could argue that the board, that she is not as advertised, and that Diller was wrong to put her on the board. In fact, Diller should kick her off the board.
It's just shocking what the elites, like the high levels of each political party, have gotten away with charity fraud and so much other stuff. I mean, the stuff that's coming out with the Biden family, the Obamas, like there's published documents showing like basically that the Obamas and the Bidens just set up more shell companies.
Yeah, it's outrageous. There needs to be a real investigation there, not one that, where you take an inspector general and you hobble that person. And, there needs to be the kind of investigation that brought down Al Capone, because that's what we're talking about.
Someone with accounting background like you, or they can program now, hopefully some technology helps so a human that's corrupt can't block it. Maybe some artificial intelligence software that can be programmed to go in there and look for the accounts that don't match or red flags that the financial statements don't match. Like you said, maybe the artificial intelligence software can be programmed to do some audits like that.
Let's hope.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Charles. My listeners, this is a very long interview and we went through a lot of this stuff, but it's just wild. All this stuff ties in. The people are forgetting the FTX scandal was only a couple years ago, but that was tied into this stuff too. And the people who are money laundering and doing the charity fraud, they got away with it. In fact, I think they were lobbying President Trump to try to get a pardon for Sam Bankman-Fried. And now Sam Bankman-Fried's on the Tucker Carlson podcast, which is, I guess, the PR, whichever PR team he hired, is doing a good job trying to get him his pardon.
It's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous.